Welcome to Pakka Nimbu podcast, and happy to have you here.
Yep, looking forward. Happy to be on a podcast. This is my first time probably being on a podcast, so excited.
Do you want to quickly introduce yourself, Harshad?
Right. My name is Harshad. I've been working in AI ML field for almost 13 years. Graduated, did my master's from IIT Mumbai 2010. Worked with bunch of startups, large companies. Currently, I'm the co-founder and chief of AI of a company called Exambit AI.
Awesome. Yeah, notable thing is that you did instrumentation engineering
Yes.
and not computer science. So you're not a core CS guy.
Not at all, right? And that's something I found very hard in the initial days when I made a switch to the industry. Interestingly, I also started to come to CS from the hardware side, right? Interdisciplinary branch. So we used to have a lot of exposure to microcontrollers. We used to build uh, small projects using microcontrollers, actual hardware. We also had some exposure to digital signal processing. The DSP processors were also rage back in the day, right? So started to come to CS not from a software side, first from a hardware side, architecture side, and then slowly upgraded myself on the core aspect of software engineering, right? So I think a very different perspective.
Let's dive into the details. This is the first segment where we'll talk about the past experiences. Where have you worked before this? Have you worked in startups? Have you worked in large companies? What has been your experience before Exambit AI?
Yes. So before Exambit, I was working for Slack Technologies, the popular communications app Slack, right? So I
Of
was part
course.
of the data engineering team. We were working out of India with the US team, right? And work with like their extremely popular projects like Slack calls. This was during COVID. I worked on a feature called Slack Huddles, right? And I landed at Slack because a US based startup, Astro, that I was working for, we were acquired by Slack, right? So that's how I ended up at Slack. So at Astro, I was the one of the early engineering employees building the backend for machine learning. Before that, I've worked in another startup in India called Sokrati. So we were an ad tech platform. Sokrati was acquired, I think, in 2018, 18, 17, 18. It was acquired by another group. Right. So I was at Sokrati for almost 5 years, set up their analytics practice.
Okay,
And
interesting.
yeah.
I had a colleague, I had actually my friend from college, Kunal Parekh,
Oh,
working for Socrates. Do you know him?
yeah. So Kunal is a very good friend, right? And he joined slightly earlier than me, but we
Yeah.
were in the core building phase of the product, working together. So Kunal used to handle a lot of back end and front end also for Sokrati, and I was the data science machine learning person. So it's a small world.
Really small world. Okay. Yeah,
And we
shout
used
out to Kunal.
as our startup school, right? Like whatever little bit gyan I have about doing business, launching startup, building products is all that me, Kunal, and all young engineers like us, we all acquired it during the initial time in Socrates.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, so you worked with Socrates and then you worked for Astro. Um, what were some of the learnings that you still carry with you today from
Uh,
those days?
so I think Socrates piece was about I joined Socrates in what 2012, where startup movement in India was again in its infancy. We Flipkart was obviously very popular, getting popular. Startups were becoming like a go-to option for us, right?
Yeah.
So fall starts also, and essentially it's a journey where you actually see founders taking bets, seeing the bets failing, right? And the sine wave of seeing the frustration that ये नहीं चलने वाला, to the other end where you say कि अरे $1 billion company बनाएंगे इस पे. So I think the learnings that stayed with me was to be patient, right? India, B2B market in India, right, is a hard place, right? And we are competing with cheap labor costs, right? So it's going to take time. It's not a sprint journey; it's a marathon, which they're building out from India,
Hmm.
right? And set your eyes up to build like good products from day one. That was the learning I took from Socrates.
Interesting.
Astro was a very different bet. So Astro was a Bay Area based startup, right? I joined them as one of the early employees. So they
Mhm.
had like mix of team, right? Some of the engineers in India and the design, some like senior engineers sitting out of Bay Area. And we were trying to build something in the email domain, right? And that was my first good long exposure to working with Bay Area companies. So again, like definitely great experience.
Okay. Was it difficult to collaborate cross time zone, 12 plus hours of difference, working from here? Did you get enough guidance? Did you feel you're working in a silo? Uh, did you struggle with late evening meetings, for example?
So late evening meetings, work-life balance was definitely a challenge, right? And it's exactly 12 hours, right? So little hard to work with. Having said that, I think it helped me mature as a contributor in couple of sense. One was it highlighted the importance of good communication within code comments, within the way you structure your documents, right? So when you're working alongside someone, and this was pre-COVID, right? And like it was, remote work was not like a very go-to idea for everyone. Nobody
Yeah.
of us had an exposure for remote work apart from like occasional work from home. So here we would have to communicate very detailed, right? Every night when you are going home, you probably set up a code review, and you are going to receive the comments on the next day, right? So the idea was you have to be very, by intention, you have to be a little over communicating in your code review, in your project review documents, etc. So and at the same time, it's cross cultural. You are working with people from different backgrounds, different nationalities, right? So it's fun. I used to also receive a lot of negative, lot of constructive feedback at my days in Astro, right? With
Okay.
some couple of very senior engineers who have been there, done multiple startups, seen multiple exits, right? And when you receive that kind of a feedback, and it's slightly different from our experience, right? So by nature, Indians, we tend to we tend to sugarcoat feedback, right? It's not in our DNA to give a very candid, but at the same time, slightly harsh feedback to each other. With this US based company, one, we were not in the same office. So feedback used to be very direct, very candid, right? And a couple of engineers and the VPs I would work with were very senior, like age gap wise also, right? So at that point of time, it was little, what do you say, not a very good experience. But uh, looking back, I think I saw that as the best part in my life, where I was growing as an engineer, as a contributor, right? I think so. What stayed with me is the value of looking at any feedback very constructively, right? And remove your own bias of feeling like, let me defend why this happened. Instead, you try to look for what the person is saying, right? I think that stayed with me. Maybe we don't be so candid or so open in our feedback, but I think it was a great experience to sort of get exposure to such an environment.
It was
Second,
bitter. It was bitter because it was direct.
it was direct, right? And maybe 5 years back, I was a lot younger, right? So when you hear a feedback like that, that you're not accustomed to, it kind of takes you aback initially. But then I think I kind of grew up from it quickly while I was working there, right? And I started enjoying the session where so essentially then you start looking forward to what kind of comments are you receiving, and then maybe you try to dig deeper, right? If a very senior
Yeah.
engineer gives you some code comment, you try to ask them, hey, is there a war story behind this comment, right? uh, yes, I take this comment, but is there a war story? Now then you go back 10 years back at some startup or some large company they work with in the US, and X happened, and from then that person would say that from then I decided to not do X, not do Y. So it was
Hmm.
a good experience altogether. I highly recommend working in a remote setting, in a cross cultural, out of India environment. If if someone gets a chance, right? It helps massively to grow as an engineer.
Yeah, it's very interesting and very good to see that you digged into the reason why they gave the comment. There is always an experience that led them to build a belief, rightly so, but understanding that context allows you to read the comment in a better light.
Yep, yep. The other
Very
thing I think,
interesting.
the difference that has also stayed with me is companies in the US tend to work with a very large capital, even at the onset of their startup journeys, right? And we don't have liberty to do that in India, right? So some of the architectural or technical choices, the way they are taken in companies in the US, are probably not possible, not feasible in India. So like as I look back from a founder's shoes now on my previous experience, I can see that, hey, some companies in the US start with like very large seed rounds, like multi-million-dollar seed rounds. So they are able to sort of throw money at some challenges initially, whereas in India we need to stay alive with a short capital and decide best how to allocate it. So I think that
Right.
is one challenge. But if you work too long with US companies and then you try to build something for India, it can be a rude awakening also.
Right. Yeah. Indian cost structures are very frugal, but yeah, that frugality can be lost on you. अगर यूएस में आप यूएस स्टार्टअप्स के साथ आप बहुत ज्यादा काम कर रहे हो. I'm sure there was a larger reason why Slack chose to acquire Astro, apart from you guys being heavy users of Slack calls, right? What was
Yes.
that reason?
So Astro was a mail client, right? So we had a consumer mail client, and when they were trying to hire me, I had again laughed at the idea, right? That mail client kaun banata hai yaar? And they said, dude, you don't know about it, just join us, right? And when I joined, I realized, oh wow, it's actually a well-loved product, right? And even in a domain that we think it's solved, like email, they were innovative. So Astro
Yeah.
had a email client with an AI integration where you can give natural language inputs to, hey, show me all the mails from Bhavin. It would do auto classification, etc. And then we were building a teams, like a shared inbox for teams, sales teams, etc. And we had a very great Slack integration, right? That was quite popular. And although Slack, people tend to say that they set out to kill email, but Slack also realized that to increase, like to expand in certain domains where traditionally email is very heavily used, like finance, legal, HR, they
Yeah.
would also need good story with email, right? And that is where they decided to acquire Astro, right, to have
Okay.
the audience in house. And so once we joined, we built some fantastic. So if you have used the calendar integrations within Slack, right, they are quite. So those were
Yeah.
built by like my colleagues in Pune, right. And I used to feel like very proud when I would mention this to people in India. Oh, you work with Slack, nice. And then they would realize that this calendar integrations and well loved features within the platform are built by a team in India. So yeah, I think that's the story why Slack acquired us.
Okay. Interesting. How was the tech journey during the acquisition? Were
Yeah,
you like building new features? How was the due diligence? I'm sure there were a ton of new learnings and new exposure to things.
correct, right? So this was an interesting experience because Slack was acquiring the product, right? The integrations, the team, the people. It was more on the product and team acquisition than a business acquisition. So there was a very thorough due diligence of the technical stack, right? They went through everyone's code. There was a security audit of the product that was launched, right? And I didn't know, right? I was not like one of the founders, right? So I didn't know that
Right.
our diligence, etc., or whatever audits they are happening, they are part of this larger story. But I got to be a part of it, where the learning now that has stayed with me is that some aspect of your product have to be in place from day one, right? So the founders of Astro, the senior engineers, had put in that kind of structure from day one.
Like
uh,
what?
for
Can you give
example,
examples?
you need from day one have your good security practices in place, right? From using separate password managers, to not having password hard coded anywhere in your code base, even for dev environment or even for throwaway experiments. uh, Thinking about PII sensitivity, thinking about compliances, right? What kind of data you need to,
Uh,
right? Maybe multi-tenant architecture where some large B2B customers might ask for certain specific security features, right? And now, if you've not architected your app to sort of potentially support this from day one, where you are just hacking things together, it might be very painful to bake that in again. uh, and especially during these product tech acquisitions, the quality of the code also is kind of seen, right? So have you
yeah.
built your CI/CD pipelines well? How is the code coverage? How is the test coverage of your code base, right?
How
This
big was Astro when you're working? Just to put some context here before we dive into tests and CI/CD. How big
25 to
was the team?
25 30 in India. We were 13 engineers, maybe 7 8 in US plus other product design folks. if
Okay,
I
so 20. That's a small team. That's not a very big team. Um, did you guys have tests from day one?
yes, yes, absolutely.
You did, and there was enforced coverage, huh,
Enforce
in the
coverage.
code.
Yes, yes. So
Okay.
essentially, I think that has stayed with me, right? The way the overall coding practices that there will be a formal code review, then a bunch of regression tests will run, and you can only commit to your mainline after after completing a set of checks, etc. So all those things were already set up by the time I joined, and I think that was the good learning, right? The initial engineers and the founders of that company had done this multiple times together, right? So it was in their DNA that even if you're starting a new idea, you don't compromise on some of these best practices, right? And we were dealing with consumer data, right? Essentially, people are trusting you with their emails, uh, right?
Yeah.
It's a retail client, right? So you have to encrypt all the data. A random engineer at your company shouldn't be able to just log into someone's mailbox and read through their emails. Now, how do you set up logging infrastructure for a sensitive data when you're playing around with sensitive data, right? So all those things were baked into the app by design.
Yeah.
Right. So from on day one of the onboarding, we got like an onboarding doc which said that, hey, first thing, like as you enter in the company, first thing that has to be set up was a password manager,
Hmm.
right? Because in a modern dev shop, you tend to use so many services for from your CI/CD to your coding, testing, analytics, right?
Yeah.
So you might become little careless with sharing password on multiple sites, etc. Right? So uh, they had baked in this practice that it's not allowed, right? And these are small costs to pay upfront, right? In dollar terms, right? So as an Indian, Indian startup entrepreneurship, I would at times frown at some of these additional cost, right? But they were baked in from day one, right? And that's a great experience that has stayed with me.
Yeah, this is where you mean the frugality can hit you in the face. US may people have that money to actually do this setup correctly. I mean, I don't think any Indian startup would even think of paying for startup managers, password
Manager.
managers in the initial years until they start making some money.
Yeah. So I think one thing that I do miss is like we don't have homegrown Indian products for these, right? I think for email domains, Zoho is obviously doing great, right?
Yeah.
But I wish there were more tooling and more affordable tooling. Then I'm sure most of us would be willing to shell a little money. Product. What happens is every user is paid like $7-8 per seat, right? It's a steep cost for anyone to use them from day one.
Yeah, but if it was something like 30 rupees or 50 rupees per head
Yeah, yeah,
per month, I think that's more digestible, which is
so,
like some 70, 80 cents, maybe a dollar if 80 rupees is the cost.
yeah, yeah.
Correct. Okay, so is there where the idea of Exambit AI came into picture? You talked about building things in India.
Oh yes. So Exambit. So I had entrepreneurial ambitions for a long time, and I was just fortunate to land in AI ML as a field. Right back when I joined, like my first org in 2010, I didn't know what I was getting into, but data science was just picking up. It was back then. It was called applied stats, data science, right? Multiple names for the same idea of teaching algorithms to take decisions, analyze
Right.
data, right? And so I had harbored these ambitions for a long time. But at Astro and Slack, I saw how products are built firsthand, right? And
Yeah.
I was a little fortunate. Slack went for an IPO, so that gave me some confidence that I can, make up on my own for a year and a half without salary. So like that's I'm just probably just got lucky there, right? Uh,
Right.
so that gave me little bit of confidence that chal jayega, and that's when they again further got acquired by Salesforce. I decided that it's enough joining bigger and bigger companies now, and I decided to do full time. I was doing the experiments on AI ML in my spare time always, right? So me and bunch of friends at Slack had tried building something on the weekends, moonlighting. But I also realized that for people to take your idea, your app seriously,
Hmm.
you have to do it full time, right? Start with an MVP maybe, but as soon as it is possible, if you are convinced, then you have to be full time with an idea, right? uh,
Okay. Interesting. So yeah, let's dive into the second segment, which is the Exambit AI and the early days of building this company. How did the idea come along, etc. I would love for you to talk about the decision of quitting the full-time job and taking this on full-time. What was the level of MVP maturity that you were looking for? Was there any hesitation? पैसे की चिंता थी? How was that whole decision of quitting the full-time job?
yeah. So money, I think, as I said, right, I just got lucky to get a bit of money from, because Slack went for an IPO, right? And I had some ESOPs. So that was like one comforting factor. And I think
Right.
that comforting factor or money is something that you cannot ignore, or you cannot, wish away, right? So you have to have, maybe for everyone, it depends on their background, how big is the family, what are the responsibilities. But maybe few months of bank balance and that you can just scrape by is the first level, right? Before going full time.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm a frugal person, so I had different set of numbers in my mind. Uh, I was fortunate that my wife was working full time at that time in a decent company, right? And she was very supportive of the idea. So these two factors,
Okay.
definitely, I was little lucky, played in my favor. MVP, I think, no, I was executing a different idea in edtech before I decided to quit full time, right?
Okay.
So I had some strong conviction on that I want to try out something, right? So this was not that I had an MVP, people using it, and then I decided to go full time. I think it doesn't go that linearly. A good phase would be that you are talking to people. People are telling you that there is a real problem, right? So sometimes you have to take that leap of faith, saying that I will experiment, I will see through this for say a year, 18 months, some timeline, 6 months, right? And then you take that leap of
Hmm.
faith, build it out. Fortunately, I think India has changed so much that someone saying on their resume that they, took a plunge for a year, it didn't work out, but here are the learnings they derived from their journey. It's an extremely valuable thing to have on the resume, right? I think that's
Yes.
where we have evolved as a nation, evolved as a tech community, that someone, taking the risk out, trying something out, learning from it is cherished, right? And even founders, senior engineers, they tend to favor people कि अच्छा इसने कुछ किया है, right? He's tried it out, so he has some
Hmm.
war stories, he or she, right? So this person will be helpful. So from that standpoint, I think we are just lucky in this era, that if you have a strong conviction about some idea, that you want to try it out, you think you can actually execute it, just take the plunge. Right, worst come worst, you can say yeah, I got a lot of learnings and come back to industry.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. The access to money is also much better now than it was a decade ago. तो क्योंकि वो पैसा है लोगों के पास, they are able to think about trying something on their own, and yeah, definitely there is a lot of acceptance in the industry. Which,
Yeah.
like, was it there?
Secondly,
Was it missing before a certain time? And did you see that behavior change where people became more accepting of
started
uh,
my career in
a startup?
2010. Sorry, I
Okay.
started my career in 2010. Back then, I don't think it was that popular to take a plunge, but some of the success stories like
Hmm.
Flipkart and other success stories just opened our eyes to the possibilities, right?
Yeah.
So access to capital, I think it's
Okay.
in two parts. Just one, your personal saving. The other is the VC money. The VC money cycle is like a sine wave, right? I don't think we should rely too much on that, because like back then in 2020, 2020, it's a euphoric time, right? Any idea was getting
Huh.
funded. You build something around
Yeah.
remote work, people would just put in money. Now we are back to probably the rock bottom, where there have been negative news about some startups, right? And now
Yeah.
suddenly the capital, especially like if you look at last 2 quarters of 2023, very brutal in terms of the total funding and total new startups getting funded. So one is that macroeconomic is going to go through cycles. What matters is, are you working on a real problem? And just be real, be truthful. See the data, how things are. Like you throw something out in the market, see how market reacts to it. Right? That's the right way to build. Like focus on the users, whether you are solving the right problem or not. money part will get figured out.
Right. Okay. So you took the plunge and you started doing an edtech problem. How did the idea of Exambit AI came around, and how was the experience like building it in the initial days? I believe it's just you and your co-founder who is writing code, and the rest of the team is just selling.
So Anubhav is my co-founder, right? I met him through a friend of a friend. He sits out of Goa because his previous company was shutting down, and he was based out of Goa, right? So we met in Goa, chit chatted about, and he was doing AI/ML for some time, very hands-on person. In fact, more hardcore, more hardware oriented than me, right? And we started, and both of us knew that we had to build around this area. The question was just figuring out what, right? And obviously, we made a lot of false starts. We started off with the idea of like building a Zapier for ML, where there will be a lot of pre-baked ML models, and any company can start. They can just plug together a bunch of pipelines and start using it. Went to a bunch of companies through friends, tried to sell it. Didn't work too well. Then we realized quickly that hey, people are looking more for bespoke solved problems, right? The number of companies in India who want to kind of build ML in-house is small, right? And those who are fortunate large companies, they have decent engineering teams. So we then kept on iterating, right? To bunch of false start. Then within that we got hit because GPT released, right? So we were sort of experimenting with GPT models for a long time, even before they were popular. Right? Reading the paper,
Right.
actually trying out. But OpenAI wave kind of hit the market like a game changer. Obviously, had to think on our toes, right? And a lot of ideas that we were thinking are fruitful were just taken, right? Because now anyone, so it kind of commoditized some of the low-hanging fruits in ML as a domain, right? Now anyone can build it
Right.
in-house as long as data security up to an extent and cost is not a challenge. People can throw OpenAI at a problem to solve it, right? So we had to again go through another iteration where we said that, hey, is there still a domain where uh, ML can contribute, where the data volume is large, data velocity is more, and security concern, right? People cannot just integrate a third-party API and start pushing the data. And that's where our other co-founders joined us. They were again friends who were iterating in finance as a domain, right? And when we sat together over like long evenings, we realized that uh, as developers we have tons of tools that help us in a day to day, right? We have version control, we have IDs that give us autocomplete. So initial idea was that hey, look at a large lender or a risk analyst in a bank who is signing off on a 10 crore loan, right? Let's say a business has approached the bank for a 10 crore loan. This entire process is manual today, right? So the company will supply a bunch
Hmm.
of documents. A large team of chartered accountants will sit down, parse through the documents. They'll create their Excel projections, and a bunch of
Yeah.
these things happen. And risk analyst finally takes a call whether to go or no go, right? And I realized after talking to a few people that apart from Excel, they don't use any tool, right? So we set out with the idea that we are going to build a finance copilot. Like we have heard of GitHub Copilot, so we are going to build a finance copilot that will work for finance, lending, legal, these allied industries, right? So that's the idea we
Right.
set out to. So, and we are so essentially, it was very clear to us that this is something that we cannot be a wrapper over OpenAI or some third-party tool, right? So we have to build this in-house.
Right.
So we are functioning, building large ML models, right? And taking very contrarian calls, right? So we are talking to a bunch of banks, small customers right now, and we are open to even doing like deploying this in their private data centers, right? If a larger
Hmm.
customer comes along and they want us to put this on prem, right? Again, that's slightly very different than the way we've been taught to operate, but we are open to the idea, right?
Yeah.
You take a proper box, you install the GPT on it, and you service them from their location if required.
On-prem is getting more popular nowadays. Many
Oh,
companies are moving on-prem away from cloud.
yeah.
Yeah.
So because this domain has bunch of compliance restrictions because it's a sensitive data, right? People's companies, financial statements, etc. There are, I guess, some data residency laws also, and in general, the industry is very what you can say, for right reasons. They are very pessimistic about sharing data with cloud service providers.
Awesome. So looks like you're in the early phase and you're still building. Would love to dive into the third segment, which talks about the architectural decisions that are taken. Can you walk us through various decisions that you took on the way? Many of them would not have worked if you want to share them. Many of them would have worked, and yeah, how it evolved over time. So, do you want to take that deep dive?
Yep, sure. So the basic idea of the application is very simple, right? So for a loan applicant right now, a bunch of documents come in. They flow through some computational step where an AI model needs to ask some question on the document, literally ask a document some questions, and some data comes out. You need to summarize it in a form that the lender or a bank employee will be able to take an informed call by looking at the data rather than looking through 50 documents, right, page by page. That's the idea. So architecturally, we have a CRUD layer, right, which ingests these documents, splits them up, does some basic pre-processing on it. So this part is written in Rust, right? And then we have our own so we took llama 2 open source model. We did a bunch of trainings, fine tunings on it for finance as a domain, and we run this on like bare metal GPU machines hosted in India for actually doing the ML fancy part of it, right? So those two are the major parts, right? A CRUD and semi-processing small satellite AI model layer written in Rust, and our homegrown AI inference engine built on top of Llama 2, that is again deployed bare metal servers in India, right? And these two, like we started off with using third-party libraries. Like this, there is this library called Hugging Face, which is very popular, right? And everyone, when they start out in AI, ML, they start using Hugging Face, etc. And then we realized that यार इसमें challenge ये है कि if something goes wrong, right, you are essentially trusting, and that library is built as a layer of abstractions because they want to make it commoditized. So we realized that
Right.
yeah, we need to know what we are running, right? If we are making a
Hmm.
promise to a bank that our AI can be deployed in your decision processes, we cannot be working on top of a bunch of black boxes, right? And that's where we decided that even if it takes a bit of time, we need to understand how the inference of this AI model is working, right? So we literally, me and
Right.
my co-founder, sat down, understood, like went through each layer one by one and wrote our own inference code in-house for the layer. Using Rust was not my call. Like I've been a dynamic language person, I didn't have any exposure to Rust. It's a call that my co-founder took because he tends to handle more on the CRUD, the security layer side. Overall, like how do you sell and serve to enterprises? He has decent background in it. So that was another learning, right? As a
Hmm.
co-founder, you don't try to make all decision yourself, right? Just trust the other person a little bit, go with it, even if it's little uncomfortable to start with.
Does
Right?
Rust has
But it,
the library support for like various libraries that you might need to actually build a cohesive software?
it's evolving, right? It's definitely a very happening ecosystem. Obviously, nothing beats Python because it's been around, right, for 30 years.
Yeah.
What So the flip side is it allows, it kind of slows you down, is what I've seen, right? Especially in a startupy mode where you are just trying to hack things together. Rust
Hmm.
kind of slows you down, right? It forces you to think through what you're doing, think through the edge cases, right? Because what I've seen happens with Node or Python is that the happy path is very fast to code with. The unhappy path, the edge cases around security, scale, right? Those you can just pepper over them initially, right? Rust kind of is little s- slow in the sense you have to think through them even on day one. But then
Yeah.
we have seen that once the code compiles and we release something to production, we are more confident than say a dynamic language. As to around the basics of the applications are not going to fail, right? So if something fails is primarily, then you are left in dealing with the business domain logic. And cost wise
Right.
also, right,
So
we can,
slowing down is a good thing.
slowing down is a good thing, right? In startup you want to go fast, but I think the nuance there is go fast on what you're learning from the market, go fast on the product market fit. The development velocity, just do things correctly, right, and stay true to your promises around security, scale, etc. It also is helping us to stay very nimble, frugal, right? Because you can run like where, like once you compile it, it's going to consume like lot less memory, run a lot faster,
Yeah.
right? So you can, you're putting, at least the CRUD layer is running in Google Cloud Run, right? Where we end up paying like
Mhm.
very little, just a few seconds of usage during the data ingestion. Because I know that most of our cost is going to be dominated by GPU and AI, and there is very little that we can control, because GPUs are, again, we import, right? We pay in dollar amounts for hosting GPU, sort of. So that cost is
Right.
always going to be there. So then we try to use Rust along these other dimensions to sort of try to balance it out.
Okay. So to summarize uh, the architectural deep dive, how does the infra layer look like? You described how is the code structured and how is the logical flow. Can you talk more about the infra? You mentioned Google's Cloud Run. What other
Yeah, I mean,
components are involved? Where do you store your
and
data?
so
Hmm?
we store our data in something called Cockroach DB, again hosted in India. Or so interestingly, my co-founder had set up the architecture in a multi-tenant. I don't know if multi-tenant is the right word, but he has set it up in a such a way that two organizations don't share a database. Right? Again, hard to sort of bake on day one. But let's say
Yeah.
a very bad data leak on one org is not going to affect the other org right away. Or let's say if one org decides to leave, stop working with us, and they insist that we have to clean up all the data, right? You don't have accidental deletion of another organization, right? So from day one, every
Right.
org sort of resides in a different database for their actual files and financial data that we ingest, right? So essentially, a bunch of Google Cloud Run services for the CRUD layer, which ingest the files. Some of the critical components are hosted on a VM, again inside GCP. The data goes back to Cockroach DB. So Cockroach is, I think, it has some nice features around replication, right? We don't want a data loss here, and set it up in a way so that the data deletion is easy, security is taken care of, encryption, right? Potentially, let's say tomorrow a customer says that we want to provide you with our encryption keys for, it's called enterprise key management, right? It's offered by
Yeah.
a large, like a lot of apps offer that for large enterprises. We can potentially support that. And then there
Yeah.
is AI layer. So there are some satellite AI models for table extraction, etc. They again run in a, what you can say, in-memory fashion on some cloud providers, where you spin up a GPU, you load the model, you do some processing, you throw it away. Right, and then there is a beast of LLM or a large language model hosted on a proper GPU machine. You build it as an image, you ship the weights, and these services then essentially parse through the file, store the data in the DB, and then through cloud task, etc., you make a call to LLM and say that, hey, can you interpret? Essentially, prompt engineering part of the LLM. The data comes back.
Right.
There is a svelte application, which is a front end where the customers see a dashboard about that particular main application. So that's largely how it is structured. So all GCP except for the GPU box, it's hosted on like a different data center.
Interesting. Um, what is the roadmap, which is the fourth and the last segment of this podcast? Can you talk about what's the roadmap, product roadmap, technical roadmap for the Exambit AI, and um, are you looking for team members to join you? So why should they join you?
Oh, absolutely. So our vision is to build like a co-pilot for, and essentially this is a boring domain, right? Finance, legal, sort of. These are boring domains. We are. The idea is, let's make money by automating boring workflows in boring industries, right? Let's not try to sort of build a new shiny object, right? let's make AI work for real applications. And that's what, like, we are very experienced founders, right? Amongst us, we all of us have at least 12 to 13 years of work experience in the industry before we started to build this out. So we are very clear that the money will be made in B2B applications by automating real work using AI, and not by building something very trivial. And we build using very bare bones tools, right? A very, so for example, don't use a library, use a very plain PyTorch inference layer for your large AI model. Try to host it yourself
Hmm.
on a bare metal GPU machine. So now my co-founder and me probably know a lot about tuning a GPU, how do you select one, etc., etc., right? So try to innovate in all parts of the stack. And the, what you can say, roadmap is to build an awesome co-pilot, right? Let's give tools for finance, legal, industries to kind of, we talk of 10x engineers in our domain, right? Why can't there be 10x financial risk analyst, right? Why do they have to read through 500 pages of documents every time they want to solve a problem, right? Why not have an agent, a junior CA that is working with them all the time, a trustworthy agent, right? A trustworthy co-pilot for them. And let's try to have some fun along the way. And we are definitely hiring, right? So we are looking for people who want to work at the intersection of, B2B enterprise apps and AI, right? And what we promise is you will actually build stuff here, right? You will actually deploy models, actually try to scale them to work at the cheapest cost, highest speed, etc., etc. And we will, because of the constraint of the domain and our own edge, we will always be building things in house, going little slow, but making a mark, right? So if anyone is excited about working on Rust, working on like bare bones PyTorch, really learning how AI apps are deployed, how LLMs work, right? They should definitely reach out to me. Like I forgot to mention, right? I used to do, and I've been still doing, is this thing where I teach people about AI and maths, right? As a side business. I wouldn't call it a business, side passion, right? I have been doing that since
Yeah.
2013. I've hosted like multiple workshops for like 60, 70 people at a time in Bangalore, Pune, Bombay, right? Where I've taught a lot of people about the basics, maths, and machine learning, right? And you can learn that firsthand if you join, right? So we have an intern. Interestingly, we found him on Reddit, right, while browsing through Rust threads, and he joined, right? And he's learning a lot, working with us about AI, about building cool stuff using Rust. So if anyone
Yeah.
is excited about that experience, definitely should talk to us.
Who are your clients? Are they just Indian banks and Indian financial institutions, or are you selling globally as well?
No. So currently, at least for next 1 year, the plan is to achieve some PMF in India, right? And hit like decent revenue run rates, right? Because even though I think AI has reduced the barriers, but finance as an industry has very different, like global markets are different, right? Average home loan rate in India would be 8-9%. In the US, again, right now it has come up a lot, but all these global markets behave very differently in terms of compliances, regulations, right? So
Yeah.
पहले इंडिया में चलाएंगे, right? Once we can satisfy and compete with Indian standards, Indian labor cost, we can definitely sell it in the US. And it's also a
Yeah.
conscious call to be a little at the start out, right?
Awesome. Sounds good. This was a great chat, Harshad, and thank you for joining.
Oh yes, absolutely, right. I hope people who listen to it take away something that is probably out from their experiences, right? If anyone in general has questions about AI ML, let them reach out to me on LinkedIn. Right? I'm generally very respondent, even if it's not related to Exambit AI. But in general, talk about this domain. I have some war stories that I have fortunately acquired over 12, 13 years. So happy to help anyone. And it I think it's a fantastic conversation, Bhavin. I really appreciate the way you have grown this podcast, right? The way you have structured. So I must mention, thanks, kudos, like all the prep that went into it. It's been a fantastic experience.
Thank you. Thank you for supporting. Take care,
Yep.
Harshad.